The dining room felt cavernous without Noel's presence. Our mahogany table, which had hosted countless family gatherings over 32 years, now seemed to mock the three of us with its empty spaces. I kept glancing at his chair, half expecting to see his gentle smile and kind eyes watching over our meal as he always had. It had been exactly 1 week since we buried my husband. 1 week since I stood at his graveside, feeling as though half my soul had been torn away. The grief sat heavy in my chest, making each breath feel like a conscious effort. "Pass the potatoes, Myrtle," my daughter-in-law Romy said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. There had never been warmth in her tone when she spoke to me, but tonight something felt different. Colder, more calculating. I reached for the serving bowl with trembling hands, still drained from the funeral's emotional toll. At 71, I thought I'd prepared myself for this day. But nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache that followed me everywhere. Wade, my 43-year-old son, sat between us like a referee who'd already chosen sides. He'd barely looked at me all evening, his attention focused entirely on his wife of 15 years. The little boy who once crawled into my lap during thunderstorms now couldn't even meet my eyes. "The service was beautiful, wasn't it?" I offered, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. "Your father would have loved seeing so many people there." Romy set down her fork with deliberate precision. "Yes, well, that's actually what we need to discuss with you, Myrtle." Something in her tone made my stomach clench. I searched both their faces for any sign of the warmth that should exist between family members who'd just shared a loss. Instead, I found cold calculation in Romy's eyes and uncomfortable avoidance in Wade's. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Romy straightened in her chair, assuming the posture she used when delivering ultimatums. "Wade and I have been talking. Now that Noel is gone, this house is going to be too much for you to handle alone." I blinked, confused. "Too much? I've been managing this house for over 30 years. I know every creaky floorboard and temperamental faucet." "Yes, that's exactly the problem," Romy continued, her mask of pleasantness slipping. "You're not getting any younger, and maintaining a house this size is expensive. Wade and I think it would be best if you moved somewhere more suitable." The words hit me like a physical blow. This is my home. Noel and I built our life here. Wade grew up here. Wade finally spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. "Mom, Romy's right. The upkeep alone is going to be overwhelming for you." "I'm not helpless, Wade," I said, hearing my voice crack. "And this house, your father and I saved for years to buy this place. Every room holds memories of our life together." Romy's expression hardened. "Memories don't pay utility bills or property taxes. Be practical, Myrtle." I stared at this woman who'd systematically pushed me out of my son's life for 15 years. The woman who'd convinced Wade that Sunday dinners with his mother were too much pressure, and that holiday visits needed to be balanced, which somehow always meant more time with her relatives. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I could feel the answer forming like ice in my stomach. "We think you should look into one of those nice senior communities," Romy said, her tone suggesting she was doing me a tremendous favor. "Somewhere with activities and people your age. It would be so much better for you than rattling around in this big, empty house." I turned to Wade desperately. "Wade, you think I should sell the house where you grew up? Where your father and I—" "It makes sense, Mom," he interrupted, still not meeting my eyes. "And honestly, Romy and I could use the space. We've been talking about expanding our family, and this house has so much potential." The meaning behind his words crashed over me like a cold wave. They didn't just want me gone. They wanted my house. The home Noel and I had lovingly restored room by room over 3 decades. "Now that your husband is dead," Romy's voice suddenly lost all pretense of civility. "Grieve, pack your bags, and never come back." The cruelty rolled off her tongue as if she were discussing disposing of old furniture instead of throwing out her husband's mother. Wade looked up then, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But then he smiled and nodded. "She's right, Mom. This house was Dad's, and now it's mine. You were just living here." I felt my world tilt on its axis. Just living here, as if 32 years of marriage, of building a life and raising a family, amounted to nothing more than extended house-sitting. "I see," I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Inside something was breaking apart. Not just my heart, but my understanding of who my son was, who my family was. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady. "I'll need some time to." 2 weeks. Romy cut me off. That should be plenty of time to find somewhere suitable and arrange for movers. 2 weeks. Not 2 months, not even a reasonable timeline to grieve and plan. 2 weeks to dismantle a lifetime. Wade finally looked directly at me, and what I saw there was worse than anger or hatred. It was indifference. Complete, casual indifference to my pain. "It's for the best, Mom," he said, as if convincing himself as much as me. "You'll see." I walked upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Noel, each step feeling like I was climbing a mountain. The room still smelled like his cologne, and his reading glasses were still on the nightstand where he'd left them the night before his heart attack. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and shock. A small, hard kernel of determination. Noel had always been the one who handled our finances, but he'd taught me to be thorough, to pay attention to details. Tomorrow, I would start making arrangements. I would call the bank and begin the process of figuring out exactly what I was entitled to. Because if Wade and Romy thought they could just erase me from this family without consequence, they might be in for a surprise. The morning sun felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as I sat alone at the breakfast table 10 days later. Wade and Romy had already been by twice to assess the space, measuring rooms and discussing renovations as if I were invisible. Yesterday, I'd overheard Romy on the phone with a contractor, scheduling estimates for, once the old woman moves out. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through familiar streets. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, greeted me with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widows. "Mrs. Henderson, I was so sorry to hear about Noel. He was such a gentleman." "Thank you, Helen. I need to understand my financial situation. Noel handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm rather lost." Helen's expression softened as she turned to her computer. After a moment, "Oh my. Something wrong," my heart jumped. "Not wrong exactly. It's just, there are quite a few accounts here. More than I was expecting." What I discovered in that bank office changed everything. While Wade and Romy were measuring my kitchen and planning their renovations, treating me like a burden to be disposed of, I had resources they knew nothing about. Noel hadn't just been a loving husband. He'd been a strategic protector. Without my knowledge, he'd been systematically securing my financial independence. Every account, every investment, every trust fund was structured to ensure I would never be at anyone's mercy. The Henderson Construction Trust, CDs that had been rolling over for years, a money market account receiving regular transfers, and most shocking of all, Wade's debt to the family business, 7,000 in unpaid loans that he'd somehow convinced himself were gifts. 3 days later, Wade called at 7:00 a.m. His voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mom, we need to talk. Now. Romy and I are coming over." They arrived exactly 20 minutes later, Romy's heels clicking aggressively on the front porch. They positioned themselves between me and the door in what I recognized as an intimidation tactic. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing," Wade began, "but Tom Bradley says he can't provide me with business information without proper authorization." "What did you tell him?" I settled into Noel's favorite armchair. "I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have expected that." "Proper procedures." Romy's voice was shrill. "Wade is Noel's son and heir. What more authorization does anyone need?" "Legal authorization," I said calmly. "The kind that comes with actual ownership." I reached for the folder containing all the documents Margaret Morrison had given me. "Your father's will does indeed leave his possessions and this house to the family. But Henderson Construction isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 5 years." The silence that followed was deafening. "Henderson Construction has been owned by the Henderson Construction Trust since 2019, I continued. "I am the sole beneficiary of that trust." Watching Wade's face as he processed the financial statements was like watching someone realize they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. "These profits." Wade's voice was barely audible. "Where did this money go?" "Some of it went to you, Wade." "Quite a lot of it." $87,000 over 5 years, to be precise. Romy grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. "These say loans, Wade. You told me those were gifts?" "They were gifts," Wade said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad never asked for payments." "He did," I said quietly. "He chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you owed. Every missed payment, every conversation is documented. But the final revelation was yet to come. Of course, there is the matter of the mortgage," I said mildly. Wade looked up sharply. What mortgage? Dad said the house was paid off. It was. But 18 months ago, your father took out a home equity loan for $350,000. The proceeds were transferred into the Henderson Construction Trust account. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old clock above the sink. He was protecting me, I said, allowing my carefully controlled emotions to show for the first time. He was making sure that no matter what happened, I would have financial security. Protecting you from what? Wade's voice was hoarse. From this, I said, gesturing to the scene in front of me. From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my oceanfront cottage in Mendocino, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the Pacific. The cottage had been another surprise. Noel had purchased it 3 years ago through the construction trust, along with a note. For Myrtle's retirement, when she's ready for ocean air and no schedule but her own. Henderson Construction continued to thrive under Tom Bradley's management. Wade and Romy had tried to contest the trust arrangements, but the investigation revealed that not only were all of Noel's financial arrangements completely legal, but Wade's debt was larger than initially calculated, just over $96,000 with interest and penalties. The settlement established a payment plan that would take them 8 years to complete, assuming they never missed a payment. It also included provisions for wage garnishment and property liens if they defaulted. A letter arrived from Wade's mom. I know you probably won't forgive me for fighting you on this, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Dad was doing. It took losing almost everything for me to see how much I'd taken for granted. I'm sorry for everything. The apology was genuine, but it was 6 months too late and motivated by consequences rather than conscience. If Wade wanted to rebuild a relationship with me, he could do it the same way he'd pay off his debt. Gradually, consistently, and over time. That evening, I did something I'd started doing every night since moving to the cottage. I sat on my deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset, taking time to appreciate the simple fact that this view, this peace, this freedom was entirely mine. No one could take it away from me. No one could vote me out of my own life. No one could decide I was disposable. The real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd found the strength to demand the respect I deserved. As the last light faded from the sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast to Noel, wherever he was. He'd loved me enough to ensure I'd never be helpless, never be dependent on the mercy of people who saw me as expendable. And he'd loved me enough to make sure that when the test came, I'd have everything I needed to pass it. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and I sat in my own home, on my deck, living my own life, finally understanding what freedom really meant. It meant never again having to beg for a place at a table that should have been mine by right. It meant peace. What would you do if you were in Myrtle's position? Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your thoughts in the comments below.